Welcome to the debate. Usually when we talk about institutional settlement rails, there is this expectation of, mechanical simplicity.
Right, yeah.
Like think of the old pneumatic tubes at a bank drive-through. You put the canister in one end, it shoots through a vacuum, and it arrives at the teller.
Exactly. It's direct, it's enclosed, and most importantly, the canister doesn't change size or shape or value while it's in the tube.
Right, it's completely predictable. But step into the world of digital asset settlement, specifically the dual-rail capital efficiency framework on the XRP Ledger, and suddenly that pneumatic tube system is handling multiple states of matter at once.
Yeah, it's a totally different physics.
It really is. Which brings us to a multi-billion-dollar question that we are answering today. Does a $1.7 billion stablecoin make XRP's price fundamentally irrelevant?
It is the absolute definition of institutional infrastructure in flux right now. I mean, we are looking at a space that was originally built entirely around a highly volatile, freely floating native asset, XRP. And we are now introducing RLUSD, which is a completely stable, fully backed dollar equivalent.
And the tension between those two assets, it is reshaping how capital moves globally. We're looking at the fundamental friction between pure on-demand liquidity, which relies on XRP to bridge fiat currencies,
right,
and this massive new wave of stablecoin settlement. My stance is that a high XRP price remains an absolute mathematical necessity for the ledger to function efficiently. Even with massive institutional RLUSD adoption, you just cannot support the sheer volume of auto-bridging and liquidity required without a highly valued native asset.
Well, the data suggests otherwise. RLUSD's zero price risk completely displaces the need for XRP as a bridge in the world's major financial corridors.
You think it completely displaces it?
I do. High XRP prices aren't just unnecessary anymore. They are ironically detrimental to the very institutions that are trying to scale their own ledger compliance and operations.
Well, let's start with the foundation of capital efficiency, because that is why financial institutions came to this ledger in the first place.
Sure.
Before digital assets, if a bank wanted to facilitate large value transfers between, say, the US and Mexico or Japan and Southeast Asia, they couldn't just send a digital message and clear the funds instantly.
No, they had to pre-fund.
Exactly. They had to leave millions of dollars of their own capital sitting completely dead in foreign bank accounts, these Nostro accounts, just to pre-fund those payment corridors.
Which, just to ground this in balance sheet realities, that means banks are suffering massive opportunity costs.
Absolutely.
In a high interest rate environment, leaving $50 million sitting dormant in a Mexican bank just to facilitate weekend transfers, I mean, you are bleeding yield every single day.
Precisely. You're bleeding yield. Pure on-demand liquidity, or ODL, eliminated that. By using the fiat to XRP to fiat mechanism, a bank could source XRP in real time, move it across the ledger in 3 seconds, and sell it for Mexican pesos on the other side.
Right.
No dead capital, and documented 40 to 70% cost cuts. But here is the mechanical reality of how that actually works on an order book. If you are moving large institutional volume, the math mandates a high XRP price.
You're talking about market slippage.
Yes, market slippage. If you need to move $50 million and XRP is trading at 10 cents, you have to source 500 million individual tokens to make that bridge.
Wow. Yeah.
Trying to buy and then instantly sell 500 million tokens is going to chew through every layer of the exchange's order book. The price will spike when you buy and crash when you sell.
Right. And the institution loses a massive percentage of the transfer just in market impact alone.
Exactly. But if XRP is at $10, you only need to source 5 million tokens to move that exact same $50 million value. The fewer tokens you have to source and move, the less you slip the order book.
Right. I see what you're saying.
And the deeper the institutional capacity becomes. A sharply higher XRP price maximizes capital efficiency. It's just math.
So I completely agree that ODL was a breakthrough for eliminating trapped capital, but you are ignoring the most toxic element of that entire equation for a modern treasury, which is inventory risk.
Well,
we have to look at the reality of risk-adjusted returns here. RLUSD wasn't launched in a vacuum. It was deployed under the strict regulatory oversight of the New York Department of Financial Services And it is backed one-to-one by US dollars.
Which provides regulatory clarity, certainly. No one is arguing that.
It provides far more than clarity, though. It provides a zero-risk balance sheet environment. Look at the players adopting it. Deutsche Bank, MasterCard, LMAX Group, and massive asset managers like BlackRock, who are utilizing it for real-world asset redemptions.
Right, the Buid fund redemptions.
Exactly. Why do they prefer RLUSD over XRP? Because it carries zero price risk. You cannot claim XRP is perfectly capital efficient when holding it, even for a short window, introduces a risk of a sudden intraday drop.
But pure ODL doesn't hold the asset for days. It holds it for seconds.
Even seconds of volatility on a $100 billion tokenized asset redemption is unacceptable when a highly regulated, zero-risk alternative exists natively on the exact same ledger.
I mean, unacceptable is a strong word.
But it is. If you are managing a treasury or running a crypto hedge fund, your risk models just changed permanently with RLUSD. Why would you accept any exposure to a freely floating bridge asset when you can settle in a stable dollar equivalent? For institutional treasuries, holding a volatile asset is radioactive. If institutions prefer stable dollar settlement, this entire narrative that the network requires a high-price bridge becomes completely irrelevant for the largest, most significant financial flows.
Okay, but
RLUSD outright displaces XRP in those major corridors.
you are describing a total replacement of the asset, but the architectural reality of the network creates a dual-rail ecosystem. You can't just pave over the entire globe with stablecoins.
Why not? If they're regulated and backed,
Because the liquidity isn't there in every pair. Think of it this way. RLUSD is the paved commercial highway for major dollar routes. It is flat, it is highly predictable, and it can carry 18-wheelers full of Deutsche Bank and MasterCard treasury settlements.
okay, I like that analogy.
But pure XRP ODL is the all-terrain vehicle required for thinner, exotic corridors where stablecoin liquidity is completely insufficient or simply non-existent.
Wait, so you are essentially admitting that XRP is being relegated to the dirt roads while RLUSD takes the interstate highway?
I am saying the global financial system is mostly dirt roads.
Is it, though?
Yes, if you are moving capital from Japan into a highly specific Southeast Asian fiat corridor, the commercial highway hasn't been built yet. There is no RLUSD to tie bot liquidity pool deep enough to handle a massive corporate payout without catastrophic slippage. To carry heavy institutional loads on those all-terrain routes, the vehicle, XRP, must maintain a high valuation. The order books for those exotic fiat pairs need XRP to be highly valued so that large fiat sums don't require draining the entire liquidity pool in a single transaction.
But that assumes the volume on those dirt roads justifies the valuation you're projecting.
It does justify it.
But if the commercial highway is handling 95% of the gross value transfer on the network because major institutions are swapping dollars and euros natively, the need for a high-priced all-terrain vehicle becomes entirely marginal to the overall ecosystem.
I wouldn't call it marginal.
The question is whether the massive volume of major corridor bridge demand that is transitioning over to RLSUSD leaves XRP with enough utility to justify a high price.
It doesn't just leave it with utility. Stablecoin adoption fundamentally supercharges the demand for XRP through the mechanics of the ledger itself. We have to look at the automated market maker and decentralized exchange protocols baked into the XRPL.
You're referring to auto-bridging.
Exactly. Auto-bridging. Every time RLSUSD is traded against another asset on the decentralized exchange, let's say an institution is swapping RLSUSD for a tokenized real estate asset or a different stablecoin.
Right.
The protocol calculates the cheapest, most efficient path for that swap. Because XRP acts as the universal denominator and the primary base pair across the entire ledger, the algorithm frequently calculates that hopping from RUSD to XRP and then from XRP to the target asset actually costs less in fees and slippage than trying to force a direct, illiquid pair.
But you are relying on secondary market plumbing to drive primary asset value.
It is billions of dollars in secondary plumbing. The majority of RUSD supply migrating to the XRPL drives massive automated, algorithmic activity.
Every fraction of a second, Software is routing stablecoin trades through XRP. This means that even if stablecoins handle the baseline settlement, the resulting residual demand and the underlying routing mathematics absolutely justify and require a high XRP price to maintain deep liquidity spreads.
Okay, but if XRP's price is low, those auto-bridge stablecoin swaps will suffer the exact same slippage problems we discussed with ODL earlier. Furthermore, all of this RLUSD activity generates network fees, which are paid in XRP and permanently burned. Institutional stablecoin adoption inherently drives the necessity of a high-priced native asset.
The mathematics of that argument simply do not hold up when you look at the proportionality of the volume.
How so?
You are conflating microscopic network friction with macro-level demand. The volume of XRP burned as transaction fees is incredibly small. We are talking about fractions of a penny per transaction.
But at scale.
Even at scale, we really need to question whether those auto-bridging fees adequately compensate for the gaping decrease in direct institutional demand across the major ODL corridors. The volume of XRP burned is microscopic compared to the billions in institutional flow that previously required direct XRP purchasing to bridge.
But the auto-bridging isn't just about the burn rate. I'm not just talking about fees. It's about the liquidity pools requiring massive dollar depth, which mathematically requires a high token price.
But here is the great irony of the XRPL right now, and it's a structural paradox that almost no one is talking about. The very banks and institutions that Ripple wants to attract to the ledger actually benefit financially from a crashed XRP token.
That makes no sense. The institutions holding inventory want the asset to appreciate.
Not if they are using the ledger purely for compliance and tokenization infrastructure. Let's look at how the ledger prevents spam. Every single object created on the ledger, whether it's an account, a trust line to hold RLUSD, or a KYC credential, it requires a reserve of XRP to be locked up.
Right, the base reserve.
Currently, that base reserve is 1 XRP just to open an account, plus 0.2 XRP for every object you add to it.
Which is a minimal security measure to prevent bad actors from bloating the network's memory. It's a standard anti-spam mechanism.
It is minimal if you are a retail user opening one wallet. It is a massive capital expenditure if you are a global bank.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Right. If Deutsche Bank or MasterCard wants to deploy 10 million KYC credentials and trust lines for their customer base to interact with RLUSD, they have to lock up millions of XRP.
Sure.
If XRP is trading at $10, their locked capital cost to onboard those users is exponentially higher than if XRP is trading at 10 cents. Every time the price of XRP goes up, the onboarding cost for the institution goes up.
Well,
by demanding a high price to satisfy the liquidity needs of your all-terrain vehicle, you are driving up the locked capital costs for the institution's focus purely on compliance registry scaling on the commercial highway. You are essentially taxing the very institutions bringing the most volume to the network.
that is a fascinating paradox, I'll grant you that. But I would frame the operational reality entirely differently.
How so?
The cost of a trust line reserve is a one-time capital lock. It is not a sunk expense, and it is not an ongoing operational tax. When you close the account or remove the trust line, you get the XRP back.
Yeah, but
Institutions the size of LMAX or MasterCard are not going to be deterred from deploying vital, global compliance infrastructure simply because a ledger object requires a fraction of XRP. Even at a high valuation, it's a drop in the bucket for them.
But why would a treasury manager volunteer to lock up $20 million in volatile reserves at a high valuation when a low valuation allows them to accomplish the exact same infrastructure rollout for $200,000? They want the underlying ledger space to be as cheap as possible. It's just good business.
Because what will actually deter them from using the ledger is if the network lacks the liquidity depth to process their macro-level tokenized asset redemptions efficiently. A cheap ledger is completely useless if it's too shallow to move real money.
Okay, but
And that connects this theoretical demand mechanics directly to actionable strategic positioning for hedge funds. If you are analyzing where the real leverage is in this market, you have to look at the institutional asymmetry.
let's talk about that.
Your ODL specialists, infrastructure firms like SBI Remit, Bitso, and Tranglo, they still process massive daily volumes and they still hold significant equity exposure and balance sheet inventory in XRP.
Right.
For those market makers and liquidity providers, a high XRP price delivers open-ended upside and efficiency.
And that is exactly the point where the strategic models diverge.
Let me finish the mechanics of why, though.
Sure.
The market makers supplying liquidity across both XRP and RLUSD have serious capital at risk in the spreads. A high XRP price dramatically improves the capital efficiency of those specific market makers.
By reducing the token count needed?
Exactly. If XRP is low, a market maker has to hold a physically larger quantity of tokens to facilitate that exact same $1 million cross-border exotic swap we talked about earlier. That increases their inventory risk in terms of token quantity, it forces them to rebalance more often, and it congests the order books. The infrastructure play relies fundamentally on the health and depth of the XRP liquidity pools. You cannot separate the success of the RLUSD highway from the structural integrity of the XRP bedrock it's built on.
If the bedrock is shallow, the highway collapses under heavy institutional load.
You can entirely separate them if the structural integrity of that bedrock relies on low-cost ledger space rather than high-cost liquidity bridging.
But they need the liquidity bridging. The smartest institutional positioning right now isn't a directional bet on the XRP token price at all. Taking a directional bet on a high XRP price is taking on unnecessary risk when there is a much cleaner, far more strategic play available.
Which is what?
The true leverage lies in being an opportunistic long on the infrastructure firms themselves, the entities processing the real volume.
You're saying bypass the asset entirely and own the equity of the processors.
Exactly. Because think about the downside protection. If XRP stays low, you unlock cheap, massive-scale compliance scaling for the banks.
Right, the 10 million KYC domains.
Yes. The onboarding costs drop to mere zero. The ledger grows exponentially in terms of users, gateways, and KYC domains because it becomes incredibly cheap to build on. The upside is then captured through raw RLUSD network volume, regardless of whether XRP is highly valued.
Win-win for the infrastructure.
Right, the infrastructure firms processing those stablecoin transactions win either way. A directional bet on the absolute necessity of a high XRP price completely ignores the reality that institutions have found a way to utilize the network and generate massive volume without taking on price risk.
But that infrastructure still uses the decentralized exchange. The swaps still happen on-chain. If the friction of price risk is gone for the banks, someone still has to provide the liquidity to make the swaps happen.
Yes, but the data suggests that regulatory comfort and liquidity depth in RUSD are far more important to a massive asset manager than the ODL efficiency of a thinly traded fiat corridor.
Well,
the strategic advantage for institutions is that they can flex between RUSD settlement, which is price insensitive, and pure XRP ODL, which is price sensitive.
right.
They have limited downside in either price regime. The necessity of a high price has been permanently displaced by the utility of a stable one. When institutions can deploy millions of KYC credentials at a fraction of the dollar cost, the ledger becomes infinitely more attractive to traditional finance.
You are treating RLUSD and XRP as mutually exclusive forces competing for the exact same function, rather than a symbiotic system.
I don't think they're mutually exclusive, but they are serving different institutional needs now.
But while RLUSD undoubtedly brings the necessary regulatory comfort and major institutional dollar volume to the network, it does not rewrite the fundamental physics of the ledger.
Well,
A high-priced XRP remains the essential native network fuel. It is the only asset mathematically capable of powering the exotic liquidity corridors and the deep auto-bridging order books that this entire newly scaled stablecoin ecosystem relies on.
that assumes...
If the ledger is handling billions in stablecoin transactions, the underlying automated market mechanics require a highly valued native asset to absorb the friction of those cross-asset swaps.
But the volume of that friction is simply not large enough to necessitate a structurally high token price, especially when a high token price actively punishes the institutions trying to onboard millions of users.
I disagree that it punishes them, but go on.
The center of gravity has shifted. High XRP prices are no longer a prerequisite for major financial institutions to utilize the network for massive capital flows. The stablecoin does the heavy lifting now.
We can certainly agree that RLUSD's adoption is undeniably accelerating overall ledger activity.
Oh, absolutely.
The total gross value transfer on the network is expanding, regardless of which asset acts as the primary bridge. For anyone modeling these flows and projecting network utility, the critical metric to monitor moving forward is the exact split of actual volume between stablecoin settlement versus pure XRP settlement. That ratio is what will ultimately dictate the landscape.
And that transition is happening in real time, right now on the ledger. We leave it to the listener to form their own conclusion on whether XRP's price remains a necessity or if stablecoins have effectively rewritten the rules of institutional settlement entirely.
Very true. As you analyze those balance sheet realities and build your models, think back to our pneumatic tube from the beginning.
Yeah.
The financial system is no longer just sending identical canisters down a single, predictable pipe. We're managing complex, multi-state infrastructure.
The paved commercial highways and the all-terrain routes.
Exactly. The paved commercial highways carrying zero-risk stablecoins and the all-terrain routes carrying volatile bridge assets are both active. They are running simultaneously on the exact same ledger, interacting through algorithmic plumbing. The question is simply which vehicle will carry the most weight in the years to come.